laptop PC, Blu-ray, and dock.
So if you think you want to plug it in, I think you can either plug it into here. That would be the easiest if that goes right to it. But you got to choose to use that in the right. You got to tell this to look there, not on the PC.
Oh,
so you're looking on the PC. If you plug it into the PC,
separate from the PC?
Yes, that's separate from the PC.
Oh shoot. Okay.
So look. I mean, so look.
There's main PC and laptop PC are my two buttons here.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so you've now got on the screen. You've got the laptop PC. So you can choose this instead if you want. Over here. So.
And then how do I get a mouse to? Well, you know what? I think that's the desktop. I think it's showing the desktop. Let me see if this works. Is that? Yeah. Okay, it's showing the desktop. I'm good. If I.
But does that show your USB?
So that's what we're trying to.
I don't think so. See, okay. This is not the.
And I connect it to the.
Yeah, there's one on
this
the
part.
Okay. The second half of the session, or I'd say depending on who's here, we want to focus on the sort of Trump analyses, and that's David and Emily and me especially, and we may. I don't think we're going to have. I don't know if we'll have anybody else Skyping in for that. So contingent on who we have and how much. That is, there are two other folks who want to be more active. Sam Lewis, for sure, and then two other people who are joining us. And so where and how to work with them links as well with the first half with Jonathan in terms of might we work with others and in what way. Okay, so I'm just mentioning for the record for the first half with Jonathan that so you know, we've had 6 people working with us since January on Trump scenes. So and the big idea is that there is not one Trump foundation. There are many different types of scenes, and that's an idea which we haven't seen practically anywhere. And to sort of try to make sense of these different sources of support, and as this is continuing now at West, we get to policies. Etc. Okay. So, with that as background, Christina, you have anything you want to fold into this? You were there, and we had the three of us had a good discussion last time. So we try to get this set up for.
I want to see Jonathan's presentation first, and.
So I guess I'll just introduce myself and talk for like 5 minutes about the presentation that some folks already saw at the Computational Social Sciences Workshop, and then maybe 5 minutes about another paper I have. So my name is Jonathan Dingle. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Booth. My research interests are sort of broadly defined about the spatial distribution of economic activity and heterogeneous economic activity across
Can you hear Emily?
Everything from the sort of scale of individual neighborhoods in New York City to across countries. So my sort of formal training is in urban economics and international economics. So sometimes I'm studying countries and sometimes I'm studying cities. And in the Yelp paper that I presented to the Computational Social Science Workshop, I'm studying individual kind of restaurant visit decisions. I guess something that I emphasize in my research relative to a lot of people that do spatial economics is emphasizing heterogeneity. Most of my emphasis on sort of heterogeneity of skills and like high income versus low income, products, or high quality versus low quality products that are made. But in the Yelp paper that I'll talk about a little bit, there was a element in which we wound up focusing on the racial segregation of urban consumption. So that's something where I am newer to that literature, or less familiar with the broad scope of work on race in American society. I've been learning about it as part of that research project, but I won't claim to be an expert. And then I think as I talk about the research, it'll be obvious how it connects with the kind of stuff that's being done in terms of scenes, and we can talk about, hopefully ways that the research agendas either proceed in parallel or intersect or have complementarities or synergies. So let me just briefly describe what we did. We refer to it as the Yelp paper because our novel source of data for describing consumers' decisions in the city comes from scraping the website Yelp. The title of the paper is How Segregated is Urban Consumption? Because something that we found that was really powerful in the data was that we could predict people's restaurant going decisions by focusing on elements of racial identity and the demographics of the residents in the census tract in which the restaurant is located. So I read the Scenescape sort of methodological section, and it seems like your broader project is organized around zip codes. We've taken the approach of focusing on census tracts. And so what we do in the Yelp paper is we downloaded every review that's been written of a restaurant in New York City. At the time we did the web scrape, it was 2011. There were about 50,000 people that had reviewed at least once some restaurant in New York City, and something like 750,000 of reviews have been written. The idea was to use that data set to kind of zoom in on a particular set of decisions that people make that we aren't able to see in conventional data sets. That is, if you were to use something like the National Household Travel Survey, in which people describe where they go around the city, there's only 200 visits to restaurants in New York City in that data set. Or 200 visits to Manhattan restaurants in that data set. So you get a very shallow picture of each city in that data set. It just doesn't describe how people are consuming in the city in very much detail. So the study's special and has a number of limitations. We do one city. We just do the 5 boroughs of New York City proper. And we download all that data, but at the end we want to know where people live, where people work, and what their racial identity is, and what restaurants they choose to visit. So we start with a huge amount of text and information and wind up boiling down to studying the decisions of 440 people. And part of that is because of how we filter the sort of criteria we use to get you into our study, which is that we need to know your racial identity based on coding the photo of the user that they post on the website. We need to know what census tract your house is in and what census tract your workplace is in. And we use the text from people's reviews to code where their home is located on the basis of when they say things like this restaurant or this laundromat or this movie theater is near my apartment or across the street from my house or near my office or this is 2 blocks away from some descriptor. Okay, so we took that text and we found a couple hundred people. Well, we can find the home location for like 1,000 people, but I need your home and I need your workplace because you might go out to eat near your home, you might go out to eat at lunch near your office, and then I want to be able to take that sort of set of people where I have good information about their geography and where they're located in New York, and then try to say, how can I predict where they're going to go? How are they going to use the city? And when we started this project in 2011 and we're gathering the data and doing the analysis a couple of years later, we thought it was pretty exciting. I think technological advance has been sort of speeding along, so you can now imagine new data sources that you would have to do a bunch of work to gather, but would describe the behavior of more people on a larger scale for multiple cities and lots of other dimensions, not just restaurants. So this is sort of an important research paper, we think, but more sort of like a first stab at the data that kind of suggests other projects or other research you could be doing. So we wind up writing down an economic model of how people choose to visit a restaurant. Not surprisingly, people are much more likely to go to a restaurant if it's closer to their home or closer to their office than something that's pretty far away. So these sort of travel time costs matter. And you're more likely to go to a restaurant if it's highly rated on Yelp as opposed to being crummy, stuff like that. I think most of the discussion of the paper is kind of devoted to things that are a little harder to anticipate, like the fact that conditional on the characteristics of a restaurant, what we find is if you're a white individual, you're more likely to go to a restaurant that's otherwise identical if it's located in a tract that has more white residents compared to another tract that has more black residents. And that could be a lot of things. It could be that 2 restaurants that have the same cuisine type, same rating, and same number of dollar signs on Yelp are not really the same. You learn additional information if it's in a white neighborhood than a black neighborhood. It could be that your friends live in neighborhoods where people look similar to you, so that's why you choose to go there. So we can kind of characterize these patterns of behavior about people, how people use the city, but there's obvious limitations to how much we can say. So that's one element on my research agenda is sort of this Yelp paper, and that's all just about visiting restaurants in New York City and the surprising sort of role of demographic differences along racial and ethnic lines in terms of predicting that behavior. Another chunk of my research agenda focuses not so much on race, but on skills, and typically, I guess, economists often use years of educational attainment as their proxy for skills. I guess where I come at thinking about the distribution of skills and economic activity across space is that lots of urban economists are content to sort of think about a model in which there's interesting things that happen in cities, like big cities are more productive than small cities. But the types of people that live in those cities are the same or just crudely distinguished as two types. They're either a college graduate or a non-college graduate. So sort of, if you've got a bachelor's degree and above, we'll call you skilled. If you, are an associate's degree or below, we might call you, less skilled or unskilled. And then when people talk about what do these guys do as far as what are they producing or what economic activity are they engaged in the city, oftentimes there's just assumed to be one type of tradable output. So like the notion of sectors doesn't even exist. So I guess I'll show you a little bit in terms of the slides, but what our goal was in this paper that we call The Comparative Advantage of Cities is to emphasize that we would like a richer picture of the distribution of activity across cities in just, sort of a simple dimension, but we want to have a notion that there's more types of skill or more levels of skill than just two, more than skilled and unskilled. We want to have sort of finer gradations where we distinguish a college dropout from a college graduate and a high school graduate from a high school dropout, and somebody with a professional degree like a JD from somebody who has just a bachelor's, say. And then the other dimension in which we wanted to recognize that the composition of how people use cities or what people are doing in cities differs is to say that they have occupations or industries. They don't all do the same thing. As you move across space, they're changing the activity they perform. And this is like super obvious if you've been on planet Earth, but it's not in the sort of standard economic models that are thinking about the distribution of activity. Or it has been at various points in time, but people have sort of decided that they don't think it's that important for various reasons that sort of baffle me, and so it's sort of fallen off the radar of the research agenda of urban economics. So this paper is more theoretical than the Yelp paper. The Yelp paper makes a bunch of modeling assumptions, but at the end of the day is trying to just characterize these restaurant-going visit decisions. This paper is sort of zoomed out a little bit more in sort of two senses. One is that we do a bunch of theoretical work that I'm going to kind of skip past. And second is, this is much more zoomed out at the geographic level. So we do metropolitan areas here, sort of unashamedly blowing off the within city locational decisions. So we're going to say that big cities, which is going to be a metropolitan statistical area like San Francisco plus Oakland all combined, those have a lot more people that are in occupations that get coded as computer and mathematical occupations. But we're not going to zoom in and tell you about, south of Market Street versus whatever within San Francisco. So it's going to be sort of a bird's eye or satellite level view of what the city does. So we're trying to, in this paper, talk about skills, occupations, industries, and how they relate to city size. So let me just give you a glance of like what our data analysis looks like here, and then I'll.
Is it easy to lower the lights a little bit?
And then I'll be very brief on this. So we start with sort of just thinking about like, what do people do in terms of where are they if they're employed in manufacturing? So manufacturing is sort of a middle skill to slightly lower skill job, in that the average employee in manufacturing is about 15 years of schooling. And we're going to plot just the log employment share in manufacturing against the log population for 276 metro areas. And the question is, do you think that employment in manufacturing is going to be bigger, smaller, or the same size across cities of different sizes? And so this is the raw data on the left at the metro area level, and then this is sort of a local polynomial line of best fit. And you can see that as a share of employment, manufacturing, and I've demeaned everything, so these are going to be all centered around 0. The share of people that work in manufacturing is flat or maybe a little bit declining as you go from a small city on the left to a big city on the right. And then, suppose we want to think about other activities. So we're going to add 2 other activities. Finances and insurance is 14 years of schooling on average, and professional and technical services about 15 years of schooling. And I don't know if this is obvious or not. I've been working on this paper for so long that I think it's really obvious, but yeah.
I can't see the axes very clearly.
Sorry, so this is metro log population. So now this is the quiz and logs, but this is basically, this is around 10 million people here, and this is around 100,000 people, somewhere in the like 11.5 to 12 neighborhood. So these are the 300 metro areas of the United States. So down here is like Enid, Oklahoma, and as we go to the right, you're hitting New York, Chicago, LA, sort of here. So every integer increment on this log scale, you're doubling the population size. So it's something like going from 100,000 here up to the point that you hit 10 million at the top. If you do finance and insurance, you can, it's a little here hard to see in terms of individual dots. There's a bunch of sort of variation that seems not attributable to the size of the city you're located in. But if we just draw the sort of local polynomial that best fits the data, you see that there's a strong increase, and as you go to larger cities, you're getting a more than 1-for-1 increase in the sense that the share of people that work in finances and insurance is rising, right? So we're saying something about the sort of composition of employment across cities. And then if we do professional and technical services, which is this lighter gray line that you might have difficulty seeing, that rises even more steeply. So as you go from Enid, Oklahoma at the bottom to New York City at the top, the general pattern here is that as you go to the bigger cities, you're seeing people be employed in more skilled activities. And we're going to write down a theoretical account that I won't devote too much attention to, but basically our story is going to be that there's differences in the composition of people between big cities and small cities, and those differences in the composition of people and the skills that they possess cause them to work in different sectors, and therefore specialize in different ways in different types of activities. So our theoretical model, summarized in like one slide, is basically there's a complementarity between the agglomeration economies that make big cities more productive than small cities. That is, high-skilled people are particularly enhanced by agglomeration forces that make make these places productive. So there's a complementarity between city size and your skill level. And then skilled people are particularly productive in relative terms when they're working in computer and mathematical occupations or professional and technical services, as opposed to forestry or manufacturing or administration jobs. And so the line of causation in our model, which we aren't going to be able to test here, is sort of there's different types of people in different places, and then those different types of people naturally perform different functions, and so you wind up with big cities specializing in finance and professional and technical services, and small cities specializing in other less skill-intensive sectors. So that's a theoretical model, and sort of on the economics side of things, there's a bunch of work that we do to try to make a model that is both parsimonious in terms of its moving parts, but delivers predictions that look like these scatter plots where you can say, well, I know that professional and technical services is a more skilled industry than finances and insurance. Is this line going to be steeper, the gray line going to be steeper than the blue line? And so that's the sort of story that we want to tell with our economic model, and then we take it to the data. So I'm happy to sort of take questions on this, but I'll be very brief. One way we do is basically draw these lines of best fit. Run a regression and say, is the line for the more skilled activity steeper than the line for the less skilled activity? So one is basically comparing these slopes. The other way that we can do it is instead basically make pairwise comparisons across these individual dots. So you take one city like Chicago and grab another city like Minneapolis, and you say, I know Chicago is farther to the right here because it's bigger, and grab two of these dots, like grab a red dot and a blue dot. Well, the blue dot finance is more skilled than the red dot manufacturing, and so I expect that the ratio of finance employment relative to manufacturing employment should be bigger in Chicago than it is in Minneapolis. So that's a pairwise, what we call a pairwise comparison, where you pick two cities and pick two sectors and make this comparison about, is the more skilled sector relatively greater employment in the bigger city? Well, you have 276 metropolitan areas. The number of pairs of cities you can pick is 276 times 275 divided by 2. It's some huge number. And the number of occupations you can pick out, this classification system we work with has, I think, 19 two-digit occupations. You pick any two occupations, any two pairs of cities, you're making millions of comparisons. So you can just draw 19 lines for the 19 occupations and compare the slopes, or you can start trying to compare individual pairs of dots. Now, This is less tightly connected to the sort of Seamscapes agenda in the sense that we've zoomed out a lot, right? We're doing this at the sort of metropolitan area level, and we've zoomed out in terms of what is, finances and insurance. We're not trying to discriminate between sort of different types of finance, right? These are sort of, if you take the whole economy and classify it in just 19 or 20 occupations, that's a pretty crude, aggregated way of talking about economic activity. My defense would be, it's a lot less crude than talking about the economy in terms of one occupation, which is sort of what the economics benchmark in a lot of these models is just saying everybody does the same thing. I don't need to keep track of sectoral composition. I'm not interested in that, right? So the same way that you guys focus on drilling down to sort of 6-digit NAICS levels in terms of talking about these different business establishments or amenities in order to finally differentiate between Thai restaurants versus Japanese restaurants, or bars versus full service versus fast food, those kinds of distinctions that you can draw at the finest definition of businesses. We're trying to start drawing distinctions, but we're doing it in the sort of let's have 20 categories level of aggregation as opposed to like the finest that we could go into data. One reason we're going to do that, and I guess this is where I can kind of transition into talking about sort of methodological choices, or what you guys have done, at least based on my reading of the sort of chapter 8 of the Seamscapes book, is that my understanding is that if you're going to operate at the sort of zip code 6-digit NAICS level, you're going to get establishment counts, but not employment levels. So your sort of amenity measure is how many bars operate in this neighborhood, and you get a count of bars, and then you have these scores for like self-expressiveness or these other things, and you say, well, I've got 5 bars, the score for a bar's self-expressiveness is blah, and then compute that out. But it doesn't say, do the bars have 1 barkeep and sort of 10 stools at the bar, or is this like a corporate operated joint that is thousands of square feet and really big, right? So we do everything not in terms of establishment counts, we do everything in terms of employment counts. So we're slicing the data by thinking about what economic activity is a worker employed in. But when I say there's a bunch of professional and technical services in these gray dots, you have no idea if these people are all self-employed, working as sort of one-person consulting LLCs, or if they all work for a giant firm that's a multi-site business that's Boeing or Microsoft or whatever, right? So we're doing a sort of people headcount thing here. My understanding of the Seamscapes.
How do you do that?
Pardon?
How did you do that?
How?
Yeah, how did you count the?
So our raw data for these employment levels is the county business patterns. Is the county business patterns, but the county business patterns does a release where the geographic unit is a metropolitan statistical area. So it's closely related to the ZIP business pattern stuff that you guys are working off of. But we can actually just take these. I guess I'm showing you occupations, not industries. So when we do industries, we can just take county business patterns and take the employment counts straight off at the metropolitan area at the 2-digit NAICS level. These are occupations.
So it's not the established number of establishments.
No. So that data, you can get the number of establishments.
Yeah. That's what I use.
But we've never plotted that count. There's literature arguing that businesses have more employees per establishment as you go to bigger cities. So bigger cities have more business establishments, but in some lines of business, and this is where it gets the details matter and the quality of the data matters. You find that there are more employees per establishment in bigger cities. So why did I hesitate when mentioning that? So like the research paper I'm thinking of is by Cécile Gobert at Berkeley, and her data source is French data. And the reason is if you want to count the number of employees per establishment in the US data, you run into censoring issues very quickly. Because if you drill down at a fine level of disaggregation in the US data, for say even metropolitan areas, if there's only like 3 establishments, they're happy to tell you there are 3 establishments, but then they're not going to disclose how many people work at each of those establishments. You sort of run into disclosure issues. So I see that if you're going to operate at the zip code 6-digit level to avoid, they're going to massively censor basically every observation. So all you can do is count establishments. We sort of,
Can we stop there? See, Christina's been working for 5+ years on these data. And we've often taken the number of establishments, just because you made the point 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, yeah.
We take the number, but then we've often
Estimate,
estimated
yeah.
the number of staff by multiplying the number of establishments times the number,
The middle
category
number, yeah.
of number of employees they have. But do we have do you have something on top of your head which would say how much is this censored by size? It's an important criticism which we should be able to address. If we can't easily, it's a powerful point. And that is, if we could simply say we have censoring of 1% at the top, and it's 17%, or it's 39% in the smallest zip codes for the smallest numbers of categories. That would be useful to be able to. And we got this for France as well.
I don't think we have any censoring. Like, we have consistent data for all, but all in the number of
but his point is
establishments.
But at what point does the employment count get censored, though?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
1,000.
Sorry.
It's 1,000.
No, okay, so they get, I assume the zip
Yeah.
business pattern is just like the county business pattern. So in county business patterns, you get number of establishments, that's never
Yeah.
censored. They'll give you bins like 1 to 10, 11 to 50,
Oh.
51 to 99 employees, and then they'll just give you total number of employees in this industry, like in this county in this year, and that is censored as soon as the number of establishments gets small. Now I guess you could take,
okay.
so are you taking the median of the bin, like the 50 to 99 category, you call that 75 and multiply by the number of establishments?
Yes.
And say there's 75?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically.
So the concern coming out of the French, let's take the results from Gobert's paper on France, where generally as you go to bigger cities, you find that the establishments have more employees per establishment. The concern would be that instead of sort of by multiplying by the middle of the bin, or given that this probably follows a power law, there's going to be more people on the small end of the bin than on the right end, the large end of the bin, within a bin. But the point of the research from the French data, where you have employees per establishment rising with the size of the city, is that actually like there's kind of a moving target within that bin, right? So instead of 75 nationwide or in a spatially uniform way, it should be sort of like 70 a medium-sized city and 80 in a big city, et cetera. That you're going to have. There might be assumptions under which you could assume this follows a Pareto distribution, so it's sort of invariant to these kind of shifts. But I think more generally, when you take like the center of the bin and use that as your best guess of employees per establishment for each establishment that's said to be in that size bin, you're making an assumption that that's sort of spatially uniform, right? And so,
but if we have data, and I'm asking Christine if we do, number of establishments and number of employees, if we have, say, 100 establishments in the smallest areas and we have no data for employees, that would be, censored, we think.
Yeah.
So could we not use those two separate items in the census as an empirical way to estimate how much censoring is going on?
Okay.
And
Yeah,
isn't that worthwhile doing, instead of assuming that it's garbage and throwing it out, or
So yeah, you don't have to throw it. So it definitely gets worse as you increase the number of digits. So like one reason, we operate at the 2-digit level instead of the 3-digit level, which at the 2-digit level, manufacturing is one industry, and at the 3-digit level, I think there's like 20 industries in manufacturing. And I know that I ran into a bunch of censoring problems even at the 3-digit level.
But how many is a bunch?
Let's call it like 10% or something. But if I pushed it to 6 digits, I'm sure it'd be half of the observations are censored. Now you can make imputation choices, right? Because you always have the more aggregated observation employment counts, and then you just get censoring as you walk down from this is manufacturing to this is chemical manufacturing to this is chemical plastics, PVC manufacturing or whatever. So you could make proportionality assumptions depending on what you're interested in doing. So if you're interested not in what's the average amount of employment in PVC manufacturing across the US, but you want to do the spatial variation, then you can make choices about how to impute from aggregate categories down to disaggregate stuff.
I would say in general, you and we and many of us in the world are more interested in how does the world work, why and how does this happen, than we are in describing the exact number of people who are working in this kind of firm in a small town outside Kansas City.
No, I agree, but
in that sense, should we say how much, how much would it shift if we did it this way or that way to try to test our hypotheses, and how much would that shift? If our sample is, let's say, the largest roughly half of the cities and half of the zip codes, and then how much does it change as they get smaller and smaller and smaller? That is there, in a sense, first there are two questions: are we doing analysis or description? I think we're both doing analysis. Second, we can say, if we're doing this for, say, the bigger places, then, or for all places, then we'd like to say, how much is there a size effect? So estimating the size effect is different from saying, how does it work? Not trying to estimate a precise size effect. And not to say that there is no size effect, but to say maybe it's not the only thing that we care about.
Yeah.
And that there's so many, that is, if we throw out if we throw out all those digits, where, it's a huge trade-off between saying we don't want any of these more fine-grained firms because they may have a 10% error rate or something larger, but we don't know. I guess I'm simply saying, why don't we try to use the conceptual propositions that we're talking about as a guide to say whether and how much we want to use which data and potentially run it by size.
I completely agree with that, in the sense that the research question defines which types of censoring or which types of bias are problematic for your exercise. So I guess it's sort of, maybe it's impossible to build the data. If you're just doing the raw sort of data gathering plus description part, I guess you want to be agnostic as late as you can, and then say, now, if I'm going to do, a regression of these establishments having more employees per establishment in big cities versus small cities, then how I define that question determines which kind of censoring messes up the answer to that question or not. I guess, so something, I don't know, it's been years since I've looked at this, but something that I would be interested in is how much the censoring, so then you could have censoring, 5 digits, 60601 is like the loop, and not, there's a decent number of business establishments there, but you go around other places, because zip codes are created on the basis of the volume of postal traffic they have. So I don't know if Chicago is its own zip code, but Princeton University is its own zip code, and it's just because the mail service assigns zip codes on the basis of how many pieces of mail, and hospitals, because their billing departments are so big. So I'm not sure that saying that you can't see 4, 5, 6 digit activities at the zip code level is necessarily just dropping rural areas. I think it might be gaping holes of censoring all over big metro areas too. But that's something that you could produce a bunch of descriptive statistics on, and then use that to inform your analysis in terms of, are you scared that the censoring is going to bias the answer to the particular question you ask?
And with 45,000 of these, these little zip codes, you can have a lot of censoring going on and still have very robust analysis potential.
If it's not differentially selected censoring. So let me ask a question about sort of choices of spatial units. So I think
do we have
yeah, you can get the
slide,
lights. I think we moved to the conversation part. I don't need the slide. So I guess I think a lot of urban economists would default to census tracts as the spatial unit. So can we talk about the choice of zip codes as the preferred spatial unit? But
county business patterns does not go below the zip code, and so that was our basic rationale.
Okay, so if you want establishment counts.
We wanted the types of economic activity, not just for the economic, but for the social, the cultural, and the meaning of all of these other things as well. And so we coded as our raw data primarily BizZip, and those data are not available below the zip code level, or yes, that isn't, or let me back up and say, slightly bent. Just want to drop the camera on the floor.
I guess this is a tension between the public data versus, so one solution to these data problems would be to go to the confidential US Census data, because when they produce the county business patterns or whatever, they've got the establishment at the address level. And so if you just wanted counts, you could,
That would solve all that. We shouldn't talk about censoring it. We should say the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess maybe you
we
guys
ourselves
can,
are not officially authorized. Or do you have someone you work with who is, so we could?
I had Census Research Data Center access for a previous research paper I haven't mentioned here, but that is sort of on a project by project basis. So I guess the difficulty here, or maybe the thing that I need to understand here, is sort of the scope of your guys' project. I mean, based on the book, this is something you guys have been working on for more than a decade, and a census project gets to go 5 years, or maybe 6 years, and then you're supposed to write 1 or 2 papers, and then they kick you out, right? You can't just say, I'm going to build a database that's generally useful to the world in order
You
for
have a clean sheet of paper.
a general purpose
Nobody
database.
carries paper.
So maybe you could describe a little bit, I guess, what the purpose of the data is, or sort of what the groups. So I've given my spiel a bunch about my research, but I also want to learn about what you guys are doing, and sort of, I've heard bits and pieces about the advantages of this data set. That's how we sort of started the conversation a month or 2 ago after my presentation. But I guess I'd like to hear sort of the broader targets you guys are trying to hit as part of sort of this massive data collection, data production, synthesis effort.
Big question. Our answer cannot be precise, in good part because we're a team project and we're working with people in a bunch of countries. The 12 years we worked on scenes continue 25 years of working with people on local governments around the world. So we've been doing this for a long time.
Okay.
And basically what we've done over the longer term is to organize ourselves by often edited book or sort of smaller projects where a group of people will get together and say, okay, let's do a book on city size. For instance, there's a massive, your main topic was some of the Europeans were very interested in, especially Scandinavians. Should we consolidate all of our cities into big metro areas, or is small beautiful? And the one bomb was after 1989. The first thing they did in Eastern Europe was to abolish all those big metro areas. And the slogan was, we'd rather have our own mayor of a city of 200 or 300 than having cheaper water. And so that democracy was more important than the price of water, even if it's the case that you do have economies of scale, and it often means that the research on where and are the economies of scale is highly uneven. And they've done a lot in Eastern Europe. So in brief, we published from the larger project 50 books. We have 10 books on scenes, and they shift with the individual national team or the group on such a city size. With the French team, and the Seoul team, we just had a conference in Seoul, Korea last week. We focused in part on the priorities of the local officials for funding, and that is we were consultants with the mayor of Paris and the mayor of Seoul. But they're often asking the same kinds of questions that we are, such as, how can you make a neighborhood more vital? How can you engage people who are in the lower status suburbs of Paris in ways that will be better than simply transferring the Comédie Française to the lowest income Muslim neighborhoods in the north, which is what the mayor of Paris and the minister of culture announced that they were doing one day. It was a disaster. Okay, so I guess I'm giving you a non-answer, or a non-precise answer. Examples of ongoing active themes. I'll turn to maybe we should turn to these 3 ladies who are really all sort of advanced PhD or recent postdocs. Why don't you mention the 3 kinds of themes which each of you are affiliated as examples of what we might be doing in the next few years? Christina, just for your PhD.
Yeah, I just finished all my requirements for the program, and I'm working for on my proposal. And I think it's very related to what you're presenting here. I want to study how that happens, kind of the same thing happens, but in a global level. So it's kind of like a similar mechanism as gentrification, but with the local being displaced by global stuff. So I want to see those things about diversity of businesses, racial diversity in neighborhoods, this kind of displacements, like how companies from other countries arrive in a city and then suddenly everything changes. So that's where I'm taking my proposal.
So
Okay.
in some business categories, like you could see, like, do I have Chinese immigrants in more Chinese restaurants? And the business categories would have a sort of global versus local distinction. But in a lot of data sets, you won't know if it's like a foreign business or a domestic business. So is that the like main data constraint you're worried about, or are there opportunities to sort of say like this is foreign displacing local? Like, how do you measure that?
I still haven't got to that part yet where I define that in my proposal. But yeah, I think there should be some sort of, or at least if it's a multinational corporation or if it's just domestic, at least something like that. But
Yeah, we did an MA and a co-authored paper with Saskia Sassen and a Chinese student and I, and we had 3 measures of globalization. It was foreign direct investment at the metro level, percentage of foreign workers, and then third, as a hypothesis from her work, what they call the intermediary firms that service bigger firms like law firms, accounting firms, and so forth. And okay, so those are three examples. Isa, you want to mention
Yeah.
your interests?
So my name is Haesal. I just finished my PhD in architecture at IIT last year, and I'm doing my postdoc here with Emily Tallinn. So basically, my interest is how the arts, Bohemia or neo-Bohemia, and cultural policies of different countries and cities can impact on the consumption, including restaurants, and also the commuting choice of people, walkability. So working with Professor Tallinn these days, we are focusing on how the small business, small restaurants and cafes are trying to thrive or getting to die in Chicago, and trying to analyze the geocoded data. So I've been working with Professor Clark for
And
almost 4
you're
years.
merging our data, basically.
Yes.
In that sense, it's a model. We have 2 separate projects. We're just starting to merge with her and to talk a little bit. She's a professor of urbanism in here. She's just come here a year ago. She's married to Luke Ansling, whose name you may know as an econometrician, basically. She's a spatial econometrician. And so example.
So in that line of
Go ahead.
So in that line of research, which things are outcomes and which things are causes, or is it so like you can imagine that the sort of like sidewalk cafes and sort of restaurants, those kind of are those the things where you want to explain like what supports them, or do you want to say taking those are there, what do they support? Or is it, I suppose a broad ranging project will say it goes both directions, etc.
Yeah. And as a footnote, Christina's worked for 5 years, and the key thing she's done is that is the chicken and egg effect. Modeling chicken and egg processes is exactly what she has led on in various ways with different methods, different time periods, different sub-industries, different ways of reclassifying the data and so forth. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay. So we are looking at the physical attributes of the streets, of course,
Okay.
but also we are looking at how subculture of a neighborhood differs. So for example, like Lakeview or Boys Town have obviously LGBT support friendly culture, versus Wrigleyville has sports culture. So we want to see how this differentiation of subculture can also affect on patterns of walkability and also the restaurant uses. So
Okay.
yeah, both physical and also
Cultural.
yeah,
so,
cultural aspects.
Wuhan?
Hi, my name is Yifan Li, and I am currently a MAP student, graduating in August, and I will start working in Wuhan, China, next September. Well, this September. We have a bunch of data. It's an institution working on cultural policy and urban policies, especially about the usage of different kinds of cultural amenities in Chinese cities. Right now, my interest is the cultural amenity usage of the second generation migrant workers in cities, especially their perceptions of their identity in cities and their loss of cultural space, etc., and that's something I'm going to work on in the next year.
So second generation migrant workers means people who do children of people who did not have hukou in that place, and
Yeah.
and then I guess all of their descendants will never get hukou. Is that
Yeah.
okay? Interesting. Cool.
Yi-Sun's PhD was on Paris, Chicago, and Seoul, as well as national data for all of the French communes, all the U.S. zip codes, and all the Korean cities, or Seoul. So both case studies with photographs and videos, and one city, and then comparative now. And so simultaneously, we've got national in ways that we're case studies of Wuhan, and the University of Wuhan is a major national university consulting with the Ministry of Culture, so we have access to lots of Ministry of Culture and other unpublished Chinese data, some 1,500 plus variables. We're collaborating actively with the folks there to try to analyze processes that overlap with other countries, to try to see how distinctive is China, or how much can Chinese policy decisions be informed by what's happened in France or other countries and so forth. So these are examples of, I mean, we could go on, there are multiple other things. Consulting with the regional government of Andalusia, where, okay, southern Spain, is this a poor area where they don't have any tourism or entertainment? No, the biggest industry is the bullfight, and has been for the whole 20th century. So the Andalusian regional government has heavily funded our Spanish national team, as has the Spanish national government, as Spain is a big tourist country. So it's easier to get funding for work in Spain than it is in the US or in Northern Europe, where people stay at home and shiver in the snow. Okay, so implicitly, one point I'm making is that there's a lot of interest in these things internationally, and that does give us a comparative advantage. I think I asked you if you knew what's the name of the guy at Stanford who's Italian.
Moretti?
Yeah, yes, Moretti. What's it?
He's Enrico Moretti. He's at
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Moretti. He's what?
Berkeley.
He's moved to Berkeley?
He's been at Berkeley for a while.
I thought he was, okay, fine. Anyway, I mean, he's doing things that are pretty close to this discussion,
Mhm.
but he's more explicitly cross-national in ways that is to say that smart economists can also do cross-national work on almost exactly these things, and it gives potentially more social science generality and power if we do so. So we've spent, that is, we go more slowly on both the theory and the data, because we're trying to bring along China and Poland, as well as Canada and the US.
So let me mention something in terms of the international dimension. So basically, having seen our theory do okay at explaining pictures like this for the US, we wanted to try to do the same exercise for developing economies, to see whether the sort of pattern of skills and the pattern of economic specialization is going to be similar. And the problem we ran into pretty quickly is that, so we want to do big developing countries, so we looked at Brazil, China, and India. And the first problem we ran into is that if you go grab standard data you aren't handed a definition of a metropolitan area that looks like what US people are used to working with, which is our metropolitan areas are defined by commuting ties. That is, you take a set of counties and then say, are there enough commuting ties between this pair of counties that I'm gonna lump them together, and that's how, you know, the New York metro area is everything from Connecticut to New Jersey, et cetera, you know, crossing state boundaries, et cetera, because the economic ties as proxied by commuting are there. So Brazil has good commuting data at a relatively small level of disaggregation, but India and China do not. And so we have a project that's in its early stages in which we try to use satellite data of lights at night and define the metro areas as being contiguous areas of lights at night.
Great.
And in Brazil, we have both the satellite data and the commuting data, so we can just kind of verify the methodology. And then when we go to India or China, we don't have any commuting data, so we're building metro areas for ourselves, but we can't really verify that they look like commuting, because that's exactly the problem we're trying to overcome. So we're trying to do some of this stuff in terms of the cross-city skill distribution, but it wasn't as easy as we thought it would be once we went to those countries and found out that they don't have metro area definitions that look like what we use all the time when we're doing US empirical stuff.
I can be wrong about China, but don't a lot of major cities have like provincial governments that are set up as the cities, like Beijing kind of has its like own provincial setup and like cities like that?
Yeah, so a lot of econ work takes the sort of prefecture level cities as the off-the-shelf definition, and depending on what question you're analyzing, that can or cannot be appropriate. Like suppose you want to do the city size distribution. Well, if you're the second largest city in a prefecture, you could be a huge area. But if you're the second largest, you are not the prefecture level city, just on an administrative designation. And so then you're not in that, you know, sort of list of cities. So one way of, I mean, we're still in really early stages, but one thing we did is, so there's this empirical regularity called Zipf's law about the city size distribution that says basically the second largest city is half the size of the top city, the third largest city is a third the size. It's sort of a power law distribution. And that's a regularity that people document all the time for rich countries, Europe, you know, individual European countries, the US, Canada, all that stuff. And there's a paper by Ed Glazer and 3 co-authors that are students of his in the Journal of Urban saying it looks like Zipf's law is sort of violated in China. And one explanation is China has all these migration restrictions and other stuff that are, you know, meaning that it doesn't look like the US in terms of how people choose which city they live in, and birth rate policies and blah, 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 and there's just a whole bunch of other planning. It turns out if you just use our nightlights defined metro areas, Zipf's law holds just fine in China. So part of it is just not really a difference in like facts or constraints on the ground, but just how you're defining these cities and the data you're choosing to work with. So this is something I'm still learning about, and I'm a total outsider too, but it turns out like some questions are quite sensitive to these definitions that you use, and the administrative definitions in one particular country don't necessarily line up with, you know, sort of what you would assume based on definitions you've worked with in other countries. And, you know, that's a blessing and a curse. If you can handle all this stuff, you might show something interesting about the world, but it means that off-the-shelf data is really sort of not commensurate or comparable across national borders.
I think I read the same Zipf's law paper by Ed Glazer and others, and my memory, if it's not flawed, is that his bottom line is not just that it's a question of right or wrong, but if you look more closely at individual countries or more specifically individual processes, there may be very important dynamics that are important to try to look at rather than just assuming that it's population size alone. For instance, the Japanese compared to the Koreans will stress that Korea and many what he maybe it's another paper, but there's another one that is many of the less developed countries, some portion of less developed countries have huge capital cities, and then the size distribution tapers off very fast. So many people want to move to the big capital city, and so Glazer has a paper and he says why, and his bottom line is not the economic dynamic at all; it's political. He said that authoritarian leaders want to control everybody, and if you want to be able to get access to the clientelist political system and be trusted enough to get contracts and jobs and promotions, you've got to be nearby. Therefore, whether it was Versailles in Paris or Seoul today, or let's say Seoul in the past under authoritarian Japanese in the early 20th century, or military dictatorships for a couple of decades, that was a driving force toward the big national dominating city. By contrast, Japan, at least, some have pointed out or suggested that the quality of education is sufficiently strong in smaller locations, smaller towns in Japan, that you don't need to go to Tokyo. Whereas if you want to go to a top secondary school in Korea, you've got to go to Seoul. So in that sense, that is so the quality and the degree of distribution of quality education can be a major driver in terms of location decisions, especially in Asia, where you have I'm adding another variable. Paternalism, the thought of the parents and the grandparents toward their own future. In the old days, the materialistic support or the spiritual support of their children living with them in the same home for 2 or 3 generations led the grandparents and the parents to buy the first home for the newly married couple, to spend all the family fortune and everything they could to get that young child into the best college possible, so they in turn would, etc. And so that kind of dynamic is different between Northern and Southern Europe, Protestantism versus Catholicism, and the Catholic countries are still less hierarchically paternalistic than most of the Asian countries. So this is not to say that any of this is wrong, but that if we introduce selectively a couple of variables for which we've got a century more of theory and case studies and all kinds of things, we can enrich the simple size economic diversification kind of. I mean, this was the core of 1880 and 1890 sociology. Exactly this. Okay. In the last over a century, we've had things added of the sort that I'm talking about, initially conceptually, but then with better and better measures in ways that we can try to say how might this work. So Moretti will do things like refer to some of this. You can't quite tell. I mean, he doesn't. Some of his lively stuff. His book is not written for. I mean, he writes very well for a general audience. He's amazing. Right. But you also can't tell, what he's basing it on. But he talks, for instance, about hair cutters get paid 2.5 times as much in Hollywood as they do in Kansas City. And so he immediately says, clearly the film industry, appearance, glamour is what is driving this. And that fits pretty easily with our scenes analysis. And so in a sense, what we've tried to do strategically is to build on the individual amenities such as barbershops or secondary schools, but to move to somewhat more general analytical categories that would be potentially generalizable to a variety of theories in a variety of countries and potential policies. And those are the 15 that we feature. On the other hand, we don't mean to present them in any sort of dogmatic way. We go back and forth all the time to the individual amenities, to voting for Trump, to in which we ought to pretty soon we ought to talk a little bit about Trump, to many other things, but always trying to use whatever combination of these in eclectic manner seems to make most sense for the particular question, policy, book, paper at hand. I would say in that sense we're probably equally committed to social science in a more general way, as are Gary Becker and Ed Glazer. And I sense what's your collaborator at Columbia?
Don Davis.
I mean, he seems to come. I mean, he may have overlapped with Gary at Columbia or Stigler, whatever. I don't know.
And he overlapped with Ed at Harvard. His first job was at Harvard.
Okay, well, all the better.
Yeah. So I don't want to stop you from doing the Trump thing. So cut me off if you want. But I guess One question is, I guess, admittedly we throw out like 99% of baby or bathwater or whatever when we do this, but I guess one strategy is like, you tell me the size of a city and I can try to predict a bunch of stuff that's happening there. Question is, when you're sort of like in the higher dimensional space, when you're doing like these 15 characteristics, can you predict scenes, or like what causes scenes to emerge? Can you say like, so I guess is one part of the research agenda trying to say what drives scene formation? Or I sort of got the sense that, at least reading the chapter of the book that I did, that's sort of the first chapter and the last chapter, the intro on the methods, was that like if scenes are sort of determined by sort of long-running historical path-dependent stuff, then like explain, you know, it might be very hard to explain why a particular industry or you know, why is it Hollywood? Why is Chicago here instead of 15 miles farther south on the, you know, Lake Michigan, et cetera? Like, some of this is idiosyncratic and it's hopeless. I guess one of the things we do on size is like, yeah, can't quite tell, you know, we don't tell you the cause of size, but give me size and I can predict a bunch of other stuff. So like, how do you guys feel about predicting scenes?
No, your last sentence is basically what most of the book does. We take most of the scene's dimensions as given, and we look primarily in the main substantive chapters at the consequences rather than the causes of scenes.
Okay.
So we're now having done that, in a sense, having established this first landmark, so serious social science analysis of scenes. We're now exploring out. We're looking as well at causes in addition to the consequences of scenes. And so the course that I taught with Christina Sakamoto this spring was called Urban Innovation, Creative Place Making. That's a hot term now among especially the arts folks. How can the arts help? I said with Christy and Heesun's PhD was one of our featured topics in the course, and she has been particularly. Why don't you just mention your policy area of transit and subways in addition to what you did before?
Well, so like compared to Chicago and many places in U.S., like policies are not really paying attention to public transportation in relation to cultural activities. But when you look at Seoul and many other Asian cities, growing Asian cities especially, they are building a lot of cultural amenities nearby the public transportation. So, for example, like a lot of youngsters, when they make appointment, they say, "Oh, let's meet at a subway stop," because everything they want is located nearby the subway station.
Which is the opposite of Chicago.
Yeah. Well, in case of Chicago, actually, many L stops are prime hotspots. So it's totally opposite from how it is here. So a lot of people, especially these days, like young generations in Seoul and China and Japan, they are also highly interested in those non-motorized transportation as sort of more egalitarian mode of transportation, but also they are using it as a cultural method to socialize with people. So yeah, that's what I have been analyzing and contrasting or comparing different cities in terms of public transportation. But also here in US, what's special is bicycle sharing system. It's growing really rapidly, and I would like to also analyze that, like how people use that to socialize, and also not just the commuting mode, but how do they use it for meeting people, and how they use it to actually travel to destinations. Yeah, so that kind of stuff.
So that's something I'm interested in learning about, the last point you made on bike shares, because I don't think there's much economics literature on bike sharing. I was in graduate school at Columbia University, so we were in New York at the time when the City Bike, which is New York's branded bike sharing scheme, came online. And our strategy was to basically, there were 100,000 bike rides taken in the first week on the City Bike scheme, So we wanted to use something that was high frequency data where we could see there are no bikes the week before May 17th, 2011 or whenever it was. And then 2 weeks later, there's 100,000 bike rides that are happening. So we wanted to see, could we see a way in which people changed their use of the city from before bikes to after bikes? So our strategy was to look at Foursquare check-ins, which is a sort of social media app on your phone where you basically, now like Facebook and all these other places also have a function where you just announce your geographic location via social media. So that is, let's call it back burner / dormant as far as my research agenda goes, but that was sort of one place where we were interested in looking at what bike sharing did in terms of which places people went that they couldn't have previously gone because they didn't have the bike share. So I'd be interested in chatting about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say a more general answer to both your specific and implicit questions is, I sense we overlap a lot in terms of some specific things like, bike share is a perfect example, but clearly nobody wants to deny the importance of population size and agglomeration. Clearly this is big stuff, and it's the first place that the demographer starts, the first place that many of the international urban discussions begin. I'm simply saying, great, for sure we need that, but let's not just stop there. And so which in a sense could potentially offer ways where we could, look at some overlaps, look at certain issues such as public transit use, or there's something else like that with an environmental focus, or other kinds of themes, and maybe look at potential overlaps, say with Emily Talon or with others who are emerging, such as there's a new urban center that's being developed here now. We could potentially approach them. And the new directors of physicists with international demographic interests that overlap with these kinds of things. So
something that struck me or that impressed me in the I think it was in the methods chapter was the claim that basically your scenes analysis is very weakly correlated with pre-existing measures that the usual urban econ folk would have run it against. Share of people with a bachelor's degree, poverty share. They're it's 0.1 or 0.2 for the correlation. Basically, you guys have a set of measures that are close to orthogonal with the usual stuff that we characterize, how we characterize places. So it seems like there's a lot of scope for potential gains if you've got independent variation that's not picked up by the usual measures.
Yes. The size of that depends, of course, on the N. If we have an N of 10, they're maybe a lot stronger. But that's one of the big things that we're looking at with Trump. Ben, do you want to mention briefly any ways that your work has come in and now, present, and future? Is you're an economics student?
Yeah, so I'm an econ undergraduate at the University of Chicago, attempting to be one. It's hard to be one here.
Transfer from Caltech, where you learn a lot of high level programming and stuff.
So last couple quarters, I worked for Professor Clark. He sort of gave us free rein to structure papers whether we wanted. The first quarter, I met with a colleague named Libby Hemphill who had taken U.S. congressional members and designed machine learning classifiers for their behaviors and done a machine learning analysis on those individuals. So I took samples for all the politicians in office for Chicago, New York, and LA, and attempted to apply the machine learning classifiers to the tweets sample for all the mayors and the aldermen for these cities, and then look at relationships between those and some of the variables that Professor Clark has studied in his Scenescapes book. The following quarter, most of my work.
So you downloaded 170. What is it?
110,000 tweets. I mean, downloading the tweets.
110,000 tweets for all these people, the whole population for the year. Rich data. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the obvious problems is that we have to find ways of aggregating. It's a lot easier to get data on citizens in sort of just by looking at the geocodes and knowing where they're located, as opposed to actually finding mayors who may differ in terms of both the quantity that they use. Each population of group for a city may have highly different sort of behaviors. So one of the biggest questions that I'm sort of struggling with is how to sort of aggregate enough accounts about the city politicians that we can actually analyze and get data on. I mean, I'm starting to question maybe trying to apply the Scenescapes work to a more congressional level might make more sense. I'm not sure, but I'm currently looking into sort of ways of expanding the analysis in terms of trying to use the theory behind Scenescapes, which I really like, which sort of Clark has tried to structure sort of a set of dimensions that you can use to measure culture by, and see if that has applications in terms of our ability to understand how people are using social media. I've tested the different methods on 2 different I've tested it on Facebook and I've tested it on Twitter. So last quarter I did a literature review and I went through a variety of literature, both political science, communications literature, as well as communications literature.
Gary Becker and some others.
Gary Becker, correct. And the purpose of it was to sort of educate myself better about these things because I didn't have as much background. But one of the things that stood out to me from my readings was 79% or sort of 60-something% of the U.S. population uses Facebook, whereas 17% use Twitter. So one of the issues I see long run in terms of trying to understand the general relationships between politicians and how they're using social media versus citizens and the interrelation between them is, it's nice to have theories about their participation, but we have to figure out what markets we're actually looking at in terms of who's using what. And I think that Facebook may be long run a better platform to work from, despite the fact that all the attention's been on Trump. The bottom line is there's just more people you're going to access on Facebook, and you're going to see more things. And I think Facebook structured itself over time to try to behave more like Twitter. Originally they used to have these walls, and it was sort of just a way to talk to your friends, and now they've tried to make it a lot more like, I can follow our, programming stuff on there, and I get updates from those, and it's just like Twitter in some sense, but with more features. So the papers I originally wrote had good ideas in them in terms of the rough methodology, but I'm trying to sort of set my compass as to where I'm going with this. And in the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at different software in terms of just like I've been experimenting with ArcGIS and some of the GIS technology to learn how I might use that with the geocoding stuff. There's different, for one of the most interesting things to me from an urban, city perspective is there's actually ways to establish maps where you can sort of track, locally real-time updates, like they have it for like weather and stuff. So it presents interesting possibilities, at least for this kind of urban work, for trying to sort of follow social media and use mapping technology. But I'm just sort of orientating what direction I'm going to go in and how I'm going to try to hone these different paper topics together to hopefully put together a coherent thesis that the TA who I had thought I should try to organize into a single publication. So still open to ideas and running experiments. And
one thing we want to do this summer is to see if we can get national data, which would permit more national, not just an N of 3, but have the whole U.S. Then we could do the kind of Zipf's law, other variables, and how do patterns vary across different units in terms of size, glamour, localism, neighborliness, and whatever. And so the have we done enough general? The fact that you've taken the time to look at that methods chapter, you've got a sense of the data, the kind of analysis we're doing. I think you can see and in this discussion the overlaps. Do you sense there are any ways that we might think of potentially sort of minimally data sharing and/or looking at maybe one small thing we could explore possibly together, for instance, with a newly hired research assistant over the summer that would somehow join some of these projects in a way that could be potentially useful for all?
Yeah, I'd be interested in exploring that. The Yelp data is distinctive in the sense that we gathered it. My other projects are sort of the satellite data. It's publicly available, easy to download. The sort of U.S. data here is all sort of standard data sources. So again, I think it would be relatively straightforward to sort of harmonize, collaborate on data sharing stuff, kind of like that. And then we just would have to look for places where there's intersection or overlap in terms of where we could basically have gains from exchange on that. That'd certainly be interesting to me.
That sounds great. Are there one or two 1, 2, 3 kinds of candidates that you're sort of thinking of this summer?
So I've got, I mean, as like the bike share thing I mentioned is sort of a back burner, half-done project that could benefit from some attention. I don't know if it's quite right for somebody new to start working on that per se. It might be too far along. And then there's other more nascent projects that are, barely exist, or I haven't even looked at how to gather the data yet, where it might be the kind of thing that people could start collaborating or trying to work together in that dimension.
You want to mention an example?
So I guess so the thing I haven't, or the thing that the thing I have in mind at the moment is actually on proprietary data, so that's less well suited for that. But I'd be interested, so I had Booth had acquired rights to get access to Twitter data, for example, and I looked at that briefly, and I just found the tweets that were geolocated were overwhelmingly just Instagram accounts cross-posting to Twitter, and that was like the only thing that had locational information on it. I am generally interested in the idea of using, as the Yelp project sort of shows, using people's contributions to social media in a way to reveal information about how they're using the city. So I sort of would like to have some sort of follow-up conversations with people about, the bike share stuff and the sort of social media stuff, but there definitely seems to be overlap with sort of research strategies that I've tried out at various points, and then they've sort of run aground either for sort of sample size issues or representativeness issues.
One of the things I was concerned about during the literature review I did last quarter was a lot of the studies I found didn't seem to have a better methodology for aggregating counts than doing it by hand and actually going in and looking up the handles, which I found in several articles that's how they did it. And these are people who do this for a living, and I found that a little concerning that they didn't have a better methodology. So I was expecting that my methodology wasn't the top one, and the fact that I found it in 3 or 4 articles was.
So they go to individual Twitter users and attempt to discern.
Yeah, they actually call it the Google search method, which is you type in the name and the whatever their position is, and then hope that the right handle comes up.
Oh, this is to find the Twitter accounts of politicians.
Which is in terms of getting expanding the N. That's one of the methodological issues, is actually getting correct Twitter accounts and verifying the corresponding individuals. And that was basically their methodology, was going through by hand doing that. And it's just, that's not really efficient if you want to get a 33,000 size N or something like,
because you want to do local government, so just the list of government officials is really long.
Yeah, so doing a large size, I specifically in my review went through not only congressional level articles, but made specific efforts to find city-based ones, and didn't find for the city ones that they used a better methodology than that. So I found people, and there were very few US ones, if any. I think in my review I cited ones from Turkey, from some other European countries, maybe a couple of Facebook ones from South Korea, but there was very little from the actual US in terms of people who had attempted to do it.
And the pessimism about that methodology, is that a statement about Twitter or about Twitter and Facebook?
The pessimism from you mean mine?
So does Facebook have an index structure that's more friendly to attempting to identify?
I don't know. I didn't think of that. That's a great question.
Twitter, basically all you get is the about me sort of section, and then if I was going to do it for Congress, you could, there's only 500 some members. You could do. I had a congressperson who happened to follow me on Twitter 2 days ago, and so it seems like you usually put, the town, the district you represent, and you're usually linking to your house.gov personal profile.
There might.
So at the national congressional level, it seems easy, but I have no strategy for if you want to find your city council persons. So I was just wondering if Facebook has something that looks more like an index.
There might be a web scraping method you could use that would say, well, if I find enough information on this page that seems like it's relevant for this politician, then you could assume that the account's accurate. I don't know.
This is something we've suffered. It turns out that big data is really labor intensive. Like the Yelp paper, to locate the individuals and know where they lived within New York City, we were paying RAs to read, because the false positive on using keyword matches is so high that you have to have humans. Well, so we use the text of somebody's review to find out if they live near the business. And so if it says 1 block away, it might be there's a better taco stand 1 block away, and only like, I mean, I guess I don't have, so I'm okay at data cleaning and econometrics. I have 0 like natural language processing skills, so there might have been a way to, you know, I don't have, the thing is basically, so some people have said, oh, your project's interesting, but what you produce is sort of like the training data set, right? So there's no accepted methodology for read someone's writing on the internet and figure out where they live. So we sort of had humans do it. You could imagine that if we took our data set and now we've had humans say false positive versus true positive, then you could go do machine learning and say, here, give me a much larger library of text and try to automate the process. But the sort of first stab at it that we took was like, yeah, this takes a ton of work. And it sounds what you're saying in terms of other people's research for like finding politicians on social media is like, yeah, it's actually a ton of labor. It's not easy to automate this thing.
And not only that, but once you've built a classifier, one of the things I was struggling with in my paper is then the question is, what are the limits on the applicability of it? Because when you try to build a classifier like the politician, it doesn't work for other languages. It doesn't necessarily work for other areas and types of politicians, even if they're US based, because they may be talking about different things. So the actual language contained in it makes it sort of highly specific, and I don't know if there's ways of measuring that, but there's a limitation on the scope of what you can apply it to, which then sets sort of a price on the research itself in terms of what benefit you're going to get out of it versus the cost.
I mean, things that are interesting as far as politicians is you have other known speech libraries, so you can compare their congressional record contributions of what they've said to what they say online. But if you don't do politicians, if it's like, you know, just how do people use the city sort of questions, then that's your only snapshot of this person's, you know, use is like, I see their Twitter profile and I can't match it with anything else as far as their behavior.
Although,
so
I mean, one of the things I cited in my paper was that, you know, if you look at, someone did a sort of a ad hoc analysis of Trump, and they were able to demonstrate that if you separate out the tweets by iPhone versus Android, that yeah, you probably saw that. So I mean, then there's the question of, if you use the congressional records approach, is it actually the person, the congressional member who's doing the tweeting, and how similar is that going to be in that case?
Probably not.
Yeah, exactly.
Trump has a social media director, right?
Right, precisely. So I mean, it's and I gather the number of Android tweets has gone down considerably. Whether that's he's switched to an iPhone or I don't know, but
a concept that real estate economists at Penn and others have used, Ed Glazer, is coming from is the superstar city, and that life is much more expensive, much higher rent in the biggest, basically it's the biggest 20 or so cities. But if we go beyond just that and try to say, why is it more expensive, and in which neighborhood, and what is there that people are paying for, what do they want specifically in these cities or these neighborhoods? Have you seen any economists, maybe Moretti or others, who are trying to pursue that in a way that we could sort of go to the next level of sophistication? And that is, this might be an area where the tweeting, the Facebook, the amenities, the kinds of things that you're working on with Emily Talin. We haven't introduced Martha Frisch. She came in a few minutes late. Well, why don't you just say a sentence or two, because her expertise overlaps here too, Martha.
I'm the faculty in historic preservation at the School of the Art Institute. So I'm not doing a degree here, but I'm interested in the built environment as the envelope for scenescapes. And so how does the built environment that a scene grows up in determine the long-term outcome of that scene? And so the perfect example that you just raised is what makes somebody move to Hyde Park as opposed to Lincoln Park.
And
so I can mention
the census collects almost nothing in the built environment. So we've got age of buildings, we've got 1 or 2 variables like that, but whereas Google has got photographs of facades. My sense in the next 5 years, I mean, we have it now, we've got the raw data now. Coding these, and again, machine coding of some facades, of squares, of the width of the streets, the sidewalks, those kinds of things. ought to be things that we can fold into this. For instance, Tokyo is a very, very dense. There are almost no parks. It's cold. It's the opposite of, say, of the English 19th century garden city, which still is there in part in India. So the Indians treasure this low density. So Ed Glazer writes about this in his book, and these Indians are just killing this. You know, the traffic is the worst in the world in India because they've got the 19th century English implemented plan. So Ed is bringing in, you know, different variables in addition to city size to show the big. And so he's a, you know, as you know, anti-Jane Jacobs, big fan of high rise, and it's more efficient, cheaper, et cetera. And the Chinese are doing more of that, whereas the Indians are doing the opposite.
So let me mention a project that Ed's got with a guy who's an MIT computer science PhD student whose name is Nikhil Naik. So they take Google Street View, which is available for parts of Southeast Asia and all the US. No, it does not cover Africa.
Okay.
Which is why there's a World Bank project that relies on a different source of how to characterize buildings' exteriors. So they've basically done a computer vision project in which their machine learning project is basically, I give you the image from Google Street View that we've scraped, and I want to predict the income level of the census tract in which this image is extracted from. And so that's totally agnostic on what the heck is a pixel in this image in terms of, is it, you know, specifically the width of the street or anything. They're gonna, I mean, I don't know exactly how they set up the neural network or whatever the machine learning tech was, but the way it's been presented in seminars, basically, I'm just, you know, gonna give this thing a training data set of Google Street View images from Boston. I'm gonna tell it this image came from a census tract that has, you know, X $1,000 as the median household income, and let her rip. And then their out of sample prediction is, we trained it on Boston, but it predicts Chicago neighborhoods relatively well in terms of, you give it the Chicago's Google Street View image, and it knows that this is high income versus low income.
Do they have any like transparency or, you know, like materiality of buildings data?
So I think they're giving, so I don't even know if they distinguish between like building versus road versus lawn in terms of like, if they're trying to take the image and split it in a way to focus on the building versus focus on the other parts of the image. I think they're being relatively agnostic in the sense that, like, how does Google collect street view images? They drive a car along with a camera, and it has sort of a 360, you know, photo lens. Now, I don't know what they're doing in terms of, do they type in address by address so that when you click on the, like, give me street view at this address, it's oriented towards the building surface, or if, like, so I don't know the details of how they're scraping the image in terms of what images they're getting. They also do it for I think it's either Vietnam or Malaysia. There is a Southeast Asian developing country where they've got income estimates from some sort of household survey or something, and then they've got the street view images as well. Africa is not covered by the street view images, so the World Bank has got a project that's run by Tony Venables, and who's at Oxford, and Vernon Henderson, who's at the LSE, where they're like trying to do, you know, tin roofs versus other, you know, the tops of buildings basically that you can see in a satellite image, and do slum classification and other stuff like this. So I mean, these are papers that I've seen in half-hour seminars, so I don't really know a lot of the details about like what they do with the street view images, but yeah, this sort of seems to be the cutting edge in terms of giving you a new measure. Now, you know, could you train that thing on US data to say, are these bars versus tattoo parlors versus whatever? Maybe. I mean, they're just doing the simplest thing, which is, I guess they must be giving it residential income, so I don't even know how it handles the images that come from a central business district. If it's all empty warehouses, do they say it's very poor, or do they say it's actually zero population? I'd have to go back and look at the paper, but yeah, so they're definitely trying to take things in that direction. As far as the Superstar Cities story goes, that story is actually like totally agnostic, at least the formal model in that paper by
Russian name.
No, it's or at least the one I know that Superstar Cities is Chris Mayer, Sinai, and Giorgio, I think it is. Joe Giorgio.
Yeah. Giorgio.
Yeah.
Giorgio,
so their story is actually that a shift in the income distribution, it's like people have idiosyncratic reasons that they prefer a particular place to live, and a fatter tail at the top of the income distribution just gives them more money to burn in sort of the bidding war for those spots. So they have absolutely no account at all about why you want to be in a particular spot. It's just about translating the more kind of skewed right tail of the income distribution into something that's going to jack up prices in those places. So I think there's other research by like Rebecca Diamond, who's a young economist at Stanford GSB, that's interested in sort of endogenous amenity production in which moving more college-educated people into an area calls forth you know, the kinds of parks or schools or what have you that are particularly attractive to other college-educated people, so that you get a follow-on effect where
Christina's taking note of that one, I'm sure. This is very close.
And in the original job market paper version of the research, Rebecca Diamond, I think, was totally agnostic and just inferring this kind of amenity value from the data without saying what are these things. But I'm pretty sure in the published version, she like had 12 or 15 indices at the metro area level for like what these amenities were, and said like, oh, you get more parks when more college-educated residents move into a metro area or something like that. So people are definitely interested in it, but like the measurement issues of either people have been agnostic and not tried to measure it at all, or then there's this like computer vision stuff at the frontier that I've heard about, but you know, I've never run a machine learning exercise in my life.
It's pretty clever. Just the approach to doing it.
If we don't have in hand, or I mean, if we find someone who comes along with, say, with Ben's interest and 5 years further experience, I mean, we would love to work with them, but probably maybe we should leave to I mean, and Dan Silver has just gotten one grant and has another one pending that is done with computer science folks who are really seriously engaged in doing this. So we're exchanging results and data and so forth with them. So maybe I'm trying to think, where do we have the comparative advantage, where there's some semi-low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, it's not computer vision probably for me.
And so looking for things that are a little more close to publishable without 10 years of work, I think probably would make more sense, at least shorter term.
Yeah, definitely.
One common thread that I see both in Scenescapes data and with this imaging stuff is, like, for example, yesterday I went to a restaurant and I wanted to look up what it looked like, and the data, like I looked in the street view surrounding images, and the images are out of date. I mean, like the stuff there isn't the same anymore. And when you work with census data, then there's also a risk that the data becomes, because it's done, periodically, it has this risk of becoming out of date at some point. And so the question is how do you, when I tried to work with social media data and connecting it to the Scenescape variables, one of my concerns was, when was the data for the Scenescapes collected versus how applicable is this going to be to my tweets in terms of the populations there and the rates which they shift. So I think in both cases, although you can build classifiers and the classifiers that you suggested may work the same over time, the more local you get, and for example trying to target like tattoo parlors, that might be much harder to target because the variety of things that you might see and the rates at which they may change could vary. So I think in both cases it's important to pay attention to sort of the long-term usability of the classifiers you're trying to build, and think about that because it takes a lot of effort to build these things.
Time is running. It's 20:08. What if we do a bit on Trump and let Emily introduce herself briefly, talk about these issues, and then maybe either have a very quick recap and/or agree to sort of revisit this when we've all thought about it for a day or a week or 2 weeks, and then see where it might make sense to go. Does that seem?
Yeah, sounds good.
Emily, you still there? You want to introduce yourself briefly, and then maybe you could even lead us into the Trump based on what you've read and what you've been confused by, or what's missing, or where we might go. As you see, we do not have most of the active players who are ranging from New York to Belgium to California and so forth, but they're represented in the drafts, which you may have been able to look at some of them. We do have David Milstein here, and he came in, I guess after you did, and you heard Ben and Martha talk. So Would you want to briefly introduce yourself and then lead us into the Trump stuff?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Crone. I am going to be a Harris student in the fall. For the last year, I've been working at Vanderbilt University in the Department of Health Policy, just as an analyst, doing work mostly on post-acute care, nursing homes, hospice, stuff like that. So, but I was interested in this scenes work that you guys are doing, and Dr. Klein was nice enough to let me join in. So, gosh, I'm trying to think.
And you have only had 1 day or less than 24 hours to access all of this stuff. So I sent you last night at 4 a.m. I think. A lot of stuff. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just to have a conversation, including you, so we can all talk about what we might do, and maybe try to pose with some of our methodological experts in the room just 1 or 2 of the questions, as well as point out these themes in case they're of interest. I mean, most directly, of course, to the work that Ben has done, David as well, and potentially some of the aesthetic themes underlying this, which at least 2 others who haven't talked so far have worked on. But you maybe tell us how far you got and any reactions to what you've seen, or if you see any glaring problems in addition to the ones which I flagged.
Sure. Yeah, I just read it this afternoon, and I wrote down a bunch of notes. Most of them were just kind of like smaller things, like more specific things that I thought of as I was reading it. This might be a good jumping off point. It might not. But one of the things as I was reading it, coming across the kind of language that we're hearing a lot nowadays, just the mainstream media and the coastal elites and the just those terms that we're hearing over and over again. We all know what they mean, but I'm just wondering if they're too, I guess, too 2016. If like when we read this paper in 10 years, are we gonna truly know what was meant by coastal elites? So that was kind of one of my questions, and I guess it could be either asset or a liability, but that was one of my questions. Is that purposeful to use that language, or should we be thinking about something not so, I don't want to say trendy, but in the moment?
Christina has worked for 5 years on how much some of the artistic and aesthetic themes are drivers or driven, and so that part of the Trump phenomenon, as well as divvy bikes, hairstyles, and so forth, is clearly very trendy and consciously tries to be that way. And that's what Baudelaire defined as modernism. That modernism is creating a situation where we need. Is the volume a little too high or too low for you?
I think my dog is making some noise.
Oh, okay. All right. It's animal noise. Okay.
All species welcome.
Okay. But that is the idea of trying to look both at the symbolic, cultural, abstract style of a city or of a neighborhood, such as glamour or neighborliness or egalitarianism. And we did that, and then when we did simply an inductive factor analysis, and then we did several geographic statistics, one of Ansling's statistics, and then we did what's called geographically weighted regression. I don't know if you two more econometric folks are familiar with that, but basically, with those methods, we repeatedly find coastal and Chicago a little bit, and a few little spots like Austin, versus the South and the Midwest as being distinctive. And this is not just city size, and it seems to relate pretty powerfully to things like localism, neighborliness, tradition of the South versus the San Francisco, Greenwich Village extremes on the other hand. And this is what sociologists and geographers and historians and economists have been writing about for over a century. It's the old urbane, rural, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, mechanical, organic, and Weber, Durkheim, Tönnies, Louis Wirth, and on up through Parsons and others. That is, we thought we had gone beyond and done some new different things, but then inductively we put in our data and we get a lot of, and it's pretty close to city size, but I think it's probably a little more the region does add value in addition to the city size, and if we then go beyond the U.S., it fits more strongly with what we talked about earlier, namely Buddhist, hierarchical, patriarchal, Southern Europe Catholicism, and then the Protestantism. But then within Protestantism, you get to Calvinism, and these are the folks who have the most red hair, the green hair. That they're the most bohemian, and that in turn links with that is themes which are not just trendy, but which are, I mean, Baudelaire talked about this as modernism, is trying to create and encourage trendiness, which he saw in the court life of Versailles, in the salons at the end of the 19th century, in the fashion industry today, in the automobile industry, or, you know, people then critique it as built-in obsolescence and so forth. So it's not just mechanical that the parts wear out, but ideally the style wears out, and Apple is doing this. So I'm simply giving you, in a sense, a series of counter arguments that it's not, the fact that it may be trendy doesn't mean that it's inherently not social science. That's all. Or that it's not. Okay.
The other thing I was kind of thinking of, I don't know, I keep coming back to elites and how, I guess, Trump, like, very uniquely kind of redefined that word to have this negative connotation and to be a stand-in for any Democrat.
No, for sure. And so for sure, I mean, what Trump said and how to interpret it is obviously very, very politically sensitive, and we're going to have political correctness problems, whatever we do with this. We've in general, as I think you can see, we're trying to approach it as social scientists. We're not engaged supporting or opposing whatever, although probably the general tone is anti-Trump. We have 6 mostly political scientists who are going to law school and who have probably careers in politics involved. Nevertheless, they said there's very little that was simply an endorsement or an opposition. There's an effort throughout most of what I think you can read to be pretty objective and to try to see what these tendencies are, and then to formulate testable propositions about religion, about income, about education, about unemployment, about changes in unemployment, and then to look at how these then come together. But the biggest original idea is that we want to look for Trump scenes, plural, and to link these in turn with the bigger, broader dimensions of the sort that we've talked about and see if they matter. And the point was, and this was, unfortunately, it is not featured. It's done implicitly in the 25-page version, but it's what Dan Silver and I have in one page in the Scenescapes book. Namely, if we had a chart like this on the board, basically, in 5 presidential elections, the last 5 ending with Trump, if we look at all the zip codes in the U.S. and look at how much the the basic 15 dimensions, they're not, the presidential voting is largely unrelated to the 15 dimensions five elections back. In each subsequent election, there's a monotonic increasing divergence on these scenes dimensions, and they map again on localism, neighborliness, egalitarianism, state on the one hand, and on the other, glamour, transgression. Christina, or who else can help me? That is, it's the urbane versus the neighborly, rural, local that has become increasingly fragmented in presidential voting.
Sorry, so you're doing 5 presidential elections, but when do you measure the scenes characteristics? I thought that the time series wouldn't go back that far.
We generally are using, we're imputing, we're assuming that we're using whatever we have. we have BizZip data for multiple years. The yellow pages is for 1 year. So probably to answer your question simply, we're not looking at change in the scene's characteristics. We're assuming that they're roughly similar.
So
over time.
A concern could be that the scenes have increasing predictive power over time, not because there's a divergence in attitudes or something, but because your measurement is getting better as you get closer to the contemporary conditions, right? If you're measuring scenes and projecting backwards, predictive power might be best when you have the least measurement error there.
Possible. Christina, any way that we could address that with what we have, or how much effort should we put into that, I guess is my question.
So what are 5 elections? So you started in '96, Dole v. Clinton, or the scenes data is like 2000s data, right?
It depends on the variable. I mean, so some things are over a couple of different times, and when we're looking at change, the biggest decade we focus on is 1990 to 2000. Because those were the main available data at the time we did most of the analysis.
I see.
But we have data back to 1980, which we sometimes look at, and we have other things that go back for further still.
Okay.
But each variable and sometimes each table is different. But I turn to Christine in part because she's been exquisitely sensitive to these issues, and has modeled them and played with them in multiple different ways, and so she may be able to give us numbers of how big are these issues in ways that I can't give you off the top.
I want to learn how to use the API. So I'm looking here how to use the Google Maps API and the Yellow Pages API, and so then we can update the data maybe, or then I can get the information that I want about like types of restaurants everywhere or types of shops.
Yeah, actually, let me answer. A better answer is in the Cities and Entertainment Machine. We took the data from the DDB. This is the data Robert Putnam used in the Bowling Alone book. These are annual surveys of citizens, 90,000 individuals, national sample of the whole U.S., and they're asked the same. There's a core set of questions that are repeated every year. And some of the folks working with us assumed there would be big changes over time, and they focused on your sort of concern. So when we did sort of analysis of variance and other things of that sort to see how big were the changes, the bottom line was the changes are pretty small. That is compared to the cross geography variations, that the over time changes are relatively small. And they tend to go in the same direction altogether. So everybody's getting more educated, and income goes up and down with business cycles, but it's not as if, Kansas City goes this way and Knoxville goes that way.
So suppose that it's not measurement error, then it's like scenes were there and they characterized what people were doing in those places, but they weren't salient or at least predictive of their political voting patterns until now.
Yeah, this fits. I mean, the bifurcation that I'm describing fits a huge debate in political science and some more general discussion. Bill Bishop is a smart Texas journalist who we were working with 15 years ago and exchanging stuff, as well as Richard Florida. And Florida just came out with a tweet that I sent around to some of you, which featured this. And Bishop has a book called The Big
Sort. Big Sort?
The Big Sort. Yeah, there we go. So you even know the book. I mean, his core argument is not everything, but one big driver is education. As people get more educated, they sort themselves more into taste-specific neighborhoods and locations. And there's a lot of migration going on continually, and people tend to migrate not necessarily to Democrat versus Republican, but they go to places that have more organic food, more Starbucks, more of the kinds of things which are coastal in that simple designation. But I guess my critique in turn of, so Florida's most recent posting says, and this is now emerging more generally. I mean, Florida's seldom the first on this kind of stuff. Maybe we should have sustainable cities segregate from the Trump Washington, and and this would be a way to democratically, with a small d, permit more people to be more satisfied. Okay, my quick critique of that is, and so he sends cites and says that the people in the biggest cities, the biggest categories of cities supported Clinton by 70%, said something like that. And then it reverses when you get to the smaller cities. Okay, what that leaves out is, what if you're a Trump supporter in New York City? And we then have a little case on this in our paper, which is Staten Island. The majority of Staten Island residents voted for Trump. How many people live in Manhattan and also voted for Trump? 53% of white women voted for Trump. There are a lot of white women who are in Manhattan. We don't know how all of them voted, but that is, if you ignore the smaller differences, you could well be crushed in a minority if we especially just have, if we have red and blue defining this, and we choose the majority. The fact that if you're in a place with 51% and you're the 49%, is that? I mean, that is where it's far from the Samuelson Arrow satisfaction of the individual citizen as one can imagine. So in that sense, I guess I'll go with the economists rather than Florida's constitutionality. Okay, so but Emily, you were starting to lead us through some of the themes. Are the themes that you read that you can see that how you would like, maybe either statistically or in some way or that is, before we get to statistical data, do you see any other modeling problems of testing propositions, as well as, we can say, looking for other propositions if you were starting that way? Yeah, they're
that I had,
yeah, go ahead.
Was, I don't know if you guys have the data and the power to do this, but the question of religion, and can you break that up into even just Christian, non-Christian?
Now we have the number of religious institutions in every zip code, and that's what we used. We have data for about 120 denominations which we can potentially bring in, but I don't think it's used in this paper. But we've got a lot of religious data. Then we have, from the yellow pages, we have individual denominations. So we have counts of We have counts of Pentecostal, we have Baptists and others, and those in turn have been grouped for some purposes into evangelical, mainline Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish.
Right. So when I was reading through it, you associate Trump and I guess just Republicans in general with Christian, regardless of the denomination. So if there's a zip code or a county out there that is rural and low population, but happens to have a lot of mosques, it's still going to show up as high in religion, but it's probably not going to vote the same way as rural towns with low population with a lot of churches.
Yeah, one of the most interesting findings that came out, and this is what I'm worried about, the robustness, is that religion reversed its sign to go positive with certain things, and then it switched over and went negative with other things. And so where and why that happens seems to be particularly interesting. That is, the substantive finding, if it holds up, is very, very interesting. But my worry is if we have that big a reversal of sign, is that 2 out of 3 times when I get this, it's multiclinearity. So that's my first thought is to check on multiclinearity and robustness of the results before we try to interpret it very much.
Do we have the data set from Amanda, by the way? Because I was trying to look at it
From whom?
From Amanda.
Yes, yes.
Because it's kind of hard to read it on the Google Docs.
Yeah, I have sent you. I think it went to you too. Access to the folder.
To the Dropbox, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at the Dropbox, it should have the raw data in Stata form for a couple of files, and so those should have all the variables there.
I have a few comments about it too.
Okay. No. Okay. Well, we're at 8 o'clock, so let's go for a minute or two. But we ought to wind up quite soon. Emily, do you have sort of a winding up comment or question, or do you mean it maybe that you and David just need a little more time? But any quick thoughts on this for now?
Gosh, I don't have my notes in front of me, but multicollinearity was the other big thing that I was going to bring up. There are a couple of areas I remember.
Yeah, I would say that's my #1 concern, frankly. I mean, there are others, but multiclinearity is certainly the very first thing we got to look at more closely. And so how to do that with these data, and so I suggest a number of possible analyses, and if you have other thoughts there, either you or Jonathan, whatever, and then joining some individual cases. You talked about those couple of options briefly. Anything else, Emily?
No, that's it for me.
Okay, David?
Yeah, just quickly, like a few things I noticed was there's like some things missing with explanation for like different variables, and that's like I think kind of important to understand like how it interacts with the model. But the ones that do exist, like for instance the age variable, I was kind of caught off guard by the like actual median and standard deviation for age. It seemed kind of low, especially for like a voting population. It was around 36, and like I haven't looked at too many studies that kind of have other ages, but I didn't know if there's something with the data that specifically tends to go low, and if that could affect things considering like the implications of voting patterns among young people versus old people, and if that makes sense.
Okay. A good general point for both of you coming into this fresh is make a note of anything that looks peculiar, like age, and it may be there's an error.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that would be pretty simple and quick for you to check on your own. You just go to something like the Google, the Statistical Abstract of the U.S. or U.S. Census, and see, what's the median age, and then we do it in a couple of different ways. Doesn't seem to match this, or I mean, if there's a real disparity, then maybe there's a problem with the data.
I'll survey some other research papers.
Good.
Yeah. And the only other thing was with poverty. I also noticed similar kind of thing, but just like there was some districts that got 100% poverty level, and there wasn't much explanation about why that might exist. There was just like one line that talked about that. So I'm wondering if there might be some other variable that's kind of getting mixed with that could be causing the 100% that we're not accounting for. But I can look into that as well. So.
Well, I wouldn't push that. I mean, that is probably the first thing is to see how many of these there are, and I bet there are no more than a very few, and it could well.
The empty warehouses, right?
Yeah, I mean the things of that sort.
Yeah. Okay.
that is, most of the data have been analyzed in what's called list-wise deletion. So he talked about the Yelp cases dropping from 7,000 to 400 when he included all of the data for all of his variables. That's the list-wise approach. We've done some of this list-wise that way, as well as kept the data for pairwise, so the correlations, I think, which are in the appendix, are sometimes show a pairwise relation. And so the number of cases varies, and that way you can see how many combinations of the two variables there are in those different cells. And so that's a way of then seeing, of qualifying the answer. And so there's a trade-off between the list-wise versus the pairwise, but generally we've knocked it down to, sorry, so the one point I was quickly making was, there are 45,000 zip codes, which include the warehouses. There, if you use only the data from the census of population on income, education, age, and so forth, then you knock out 10,000 cases, and that knocks out the warehouses and so forth, because you have data, at least for those places, that include standard residents. So don't worry. I mean, okay. Then when you get to other data, the variables maybe so it's the one which knocks it down the most is percent voting for Trump, and those are only for 3,000 counties. So when we're doing anything that's just with Trump voting, the N is only 3,000. And Amanda did not realize that her Stata program algorithm always computes list-wise. So you've never got more than 3,000 real cases in these data. So she looked, and so because we've got the zip codes and the county data there, she kept looking at it. So we got 27,000. We really don't. I mean, if you look at in the algorithm, and maybe Jonathan has any further thoughts about how Stata does this, but we don't see an easy way to see how many cases we've really got. And I should point to Emily as well. How many cases have we got in the whole model, or then
matching throughout?
Yeah, matching throughout, because we've generally got this a model of say 10 or 15 variables. Then we've added interaction terms, and those in turn may, depending on which, if we add a new variable, that in turn knocks down the n further. Okay. So Jonathan, any thoughts on how to handle
each row in the so you have an estimation array that's got your left-hand side and then 15 things on the right-hand side. There might be missing stuff. Each row in this array is a county, and you've taken zips and aggregated them up to the county level.
Our unit is the zip code, but we repeat the data entries. Say if we have 150 zip codes in one county, we use the same value, which is the county average, for all of those zip codes.
Okay, so sorry, what's the left-hand side? What's the outcome variable?
Trump voting.
Oh, okay, and so it's the left-hand side variable that's the county level vote that's being repeated. And
Yeah,
the right-hand side variable
but
is
the data matrix has everything by zip code, including Trump voting.
Yeah.
But everybody in Manhattan gets the same score,
Right.
no matter what the zip code is within Manhattan.
So I think there's an equivalent regression that, so if you're running that as OLS, there's an equivalent regression where you make everything county level averages, where the weights are implicitly the number of zip codes per county, I think is what that regression is equivalent to.
And I think Stata's doing that.
Now the question is, if you've got a missing characteristic for one zip, when you form, so the way Stata handles, if you formed county level averages, Stata would just drop the missing observations when computing the average for the county, and then it would depend exactly how you collapse this. But if you're actually running it with a regression to 27,000 rows where you've repeated the left-hand side, then I guess it's like you're running a county level regression with the weights being the number of zip codes in that county that are missing none of the characteristics you put on the right-hand side. And so to compute, how many cases you actually have for each county, you just need to take the list of each covariate and is it missing, and then basically if any are missing, then Stata drops the entire observation. And so that's what your weighting scheme implicitly is basically complete rows. The number of zips that are complete rows in that county is the weight that county is getting.
And that's the easy part. I guess the hard part is when is the multicollinearity bad enough we need to worry?
So I never worry, so multicollinearity means that your specifications might be sensitive to the dropping or adding a variable. I actually tend not to worry about multicollinearity because it just translates into standard errors being large. So there's this old argument in econometrics, and I might be Arthur Goldberger, but I might be forgetting it wrong, where he says multicollinearity is basically the same issue as micronumerosity, which is you don't have enough variation to work with. That happens when you have small sample sizes or when stuff is moving together so you can't tell them apart. And yeah, the standard errors will blow up on those two terms. This thing where it's flipping sign, I guess, it's flipping sign when you drop or add something that moves very similar, that is collinear with the religiosity count, the religious establishment count?
We're not sure at this point. We've got the results, and then Amanda, who ran it, really just was not sensitive enough to the potential multicollinearity problem. So we're going back and revisiting and thinking how can we check for the robustness. And I mean, one basic way that I've simply talked about is simply, and is in the memo, is simply try it with and without. Just slightly change the model and see if it's consistent if you simplify the model and drop out the more fancy 1, 2, 3-way interaction terms, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So we often get these reversal of signs in the interaction terms, 2 and 3-way.
I mean, I guess the difficulty here is you don't have there's not a theory that tells you the correct functional form. So because if it flipping sign when you drop some interactions or not is something about omitted variable, is about, if you drop something that's orthogonal, then nothing happens to the sign. So you're learning sort of about whether this thing is collinear, and then sort of about if there's not a correct functional form, then it's not clear. If you're trying to maximize sort of predictive power, then there are like FSTATs and other procedures that basically give you some sort of penalty for having too much crap on the right-hand side, but say, well, I want to be able to have predictive power. But if you are trying to do causal inference and say, is it really religiosity is causing this viewpoint, then it's a lot thornier issue.
And that's where we are. It's a thorny issue. So maybe one variable, 1 or 2 variables in that at a time, and anything else that we can come up with is fine to play with. And then just going back to the simple R. So there is a simpler model of say that before we have any interaction terms, and then go back to the simple correlation matrix. If we get the same signs again and again and again, that gives us confidence that we're not just getting random noise. Okay. What if we? Well, David, any last quick questions? Comments?
I think that last one you just made about getting rid of the interaction terms is good to kind of act as.
Okay. Jonathan, any bottom line conclusions you want to offer at this point?
Let me just advertise myself in the sense that I enjoyed the conversation and would be happy to follow up with people. So
I'm interested.
My surname is spelled Dingle, D-I-N-G-E-L, and it's easy to find my faculty webpage on the booth. So if you want to email me, but I'll stick around for a couple of minutes so people can follow up individually, because between machine learning and tweets and bike share and how to classify businesses, it sounds like I have overlapping interests with a whole bunch of people in the room. So it's nice to meet everybody, and look forward to continuing the conversation in that vein.
Excellent. Okay. Why don't we end on that note, and we can talk individually for a couple more minutes. Thanks for joining.